Sometimes when I've made videos about the less than brilliant decisions I've made in psychosis, I'll get comments from people saying things along the lines of, you should have thought that through. You should have thought better than to do that. What were you thinking? Why didn't you think of this? Why didn't you think of that? You should have thought this, that, and the other. You should have thought anything. The thing is that by the very nature of what psychosis is, I am unable to think like other people when I'm in that state. So people who comment things like, you should have thought that through, you should have thought clearly, these are not possible for me. These are probably the entire point of psychosis, is that I can't think like other people anymore. I can't perceive reality the way that other people perceive it. And while that may seem kind of hard for some people to grasp, with a basic understanding of psychosis, you'd see that it's really not that hard to get. If you were to go inside the mind of a person with psychosis and see what they see and believe what they believe, you will find that they do have their own rationalities and logic that make sense. It's just that they only make sense when applied to the reality that is being individually experienced by this person. So no, it might not seem to make sense to anyone outside of this world of theirs, but in that world, it's actually fairly logical. So while I can't think clearly and coherently, and while I can't use logic and reasoning skills or judgment the way I might outside of psychosis, I do have a really in-depth thought process that makes some amount of sense. So allow me in this video today to tell you what my thought process is like in psychosis and how it's actually kind of sensible. So close your eyes and dream me home. Before we get started, I would like to throw a disclaimer on this video to say that I am not a mental health care professional and I am in no way qualified to give any advice, medical, psychiatric, or otherwise. Who I am simply is a person with lived experience having serious mental illness who is here to share with you the wisdom and insight I've gleaned along my journey of mental health recovery. Also, a trigger warning to say that the subject of psychosis in and of itself is a sensitive subject that may at times be difficult to talk about. So if at any point during today's video I say anything that may be triggering or upsetting to you, you are more than welcome to leave the video. Let me play out a scenario for you that may or may not be relatable. Say that you are standing and reading a book in an empty room, and out of nowhere, a man comes up and starts berating you. Hey, what are you reading? What's in that book? What's it about? Hey, answer me. Why aren't you listening to me? Hey, I'm asking you a question. He gets up in your face. You can feel his breath on your ear. He's smelling your hair. It's creepy. What would you do? Well, to anyone who's ever been bullied, who's ever been verbally harassed, this might stir up some reactions in you, and you might be instantly able to think, I would jump out of the way. I would punch him in the face. I would freeze out of terror. You know, any one of these responses would be rational. When this specific scenario happened to me, I froze because I tend to get really timid and I don't fight back. Now, maybe it would have been a better solution to step away, what have you, but this is what I did. I stood there until the man ran out of words to yell in my face and walked away. I didn't give him the reaction he wanted and he left. Now, that makes sense until you realize that that man was never there. And to anyone who was watching, I was just standing completely still, looking terrified. So that to them might not make sense, but to me, because I didn't know that was a hallucination, I responded accordingly. The reactions that people have to their reality in psychosis could on the outside seem really strange, but they make sense. They are logical responses to illogical situations or concepts. So these reactions are probably what anyone else would have if this were real. It's just that it's only happening to this one person, and that's why it seems so strange, especially because a lot of the symptoms are very bizarre. And now when it comes to bizarre and non-bizarre symptoms, you have symptoms that are not possible, like for me, being abducted by aliens, that's a common delusion I would have. And non-bizarre would be things like with that interaction with that man of a person just yelling at me, that could happen in reality. So when you have either non-bizarre or bizarre hallucinations and delusions, it'll elicit a reaction. And that reaction, when applied to that specific scenario, makes sense. And with the bizarre ones, it might not seem to, because that's not possible. But even if it were, it still makes sense. Beyond even thoughts, a lot of reactions that I would have, especially with bizarre symptoms, were so normal. They were things that anyone would feel if this were happening. As I said, I tend to believe that I'm being abducted by aliens, and this has been in instances where I'm being taken places, like when I was being taken into the police station, when I was being taken onto the psych ward, and it brought upon some really rational fears. And I think that would be anyone's response. I think even though it's not possible, or at least not common if it is possible, people being abducted by aliens would probably be afraid. They'd probably be, very heightened. Like they might have their heart racing. They might be feeling sweaty hands. They might have knots in their stomach. Okay, these are normal responses. It's just that this would not typically happen. I would have that lamb to the slaughter gut instinct of fight or flight. I need to get out of here. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get away from this, spaceship. And I would run, and I'd get caught, and I'd end up back in the jail cell or the psych ward. But that is normal. That is human nature. That is primal instinct. That is what we are designed to feel in that circumstance. And in fact, that primal instinct does lend itself to a somewhat different, somewhat chaotic thought process. Sometimes in psychosis, there is an amount of rationality, but that all goes out the window when the paranoia kicks in and I suddenly feel that my life is in danger and that I am going to be abducted or killed or tortured. That's when survival mode kicks in. And in survival mode, I'm not thinking clearly. I'm thinking, what can I do right now to save my life? And I will do anything to save my life. And I will do things that are so against my nature, things that are so desperate, because in survival mode, it doesn't matter if it makes sense. It just matters if I make it out alive. In that mode, my thoughts are rapid fire, and I'm really not thinking them through. I'm not even super aware that these thoughts are flying through my head, because it's go, go, go. It's do the next thing, do the thing after that, without even stopping to consider what I'm doing. And I think one example that I use a lot is the time that I went streaking, because this was one of the most heightened episodes of paranoia I've had, which is such a clear example of just what it takes to survive. This was the kind of survival mode that I was in that I think is similar to people who are stranded in the wilderness, like those rugby players that crash landed in the Andes for 72 days, like that kind of survival. That was the pressure I felt that I was under, and maybe I wasn't, but that's how it felt. And the process that it took from, oh my God, I'm being tracked, I'm going to be abducted, realizing everyone around me is a spy who's sending my coordinates to the FBI, diving into a bush, stripping out of my clothes, thinking I'll be invisible if I'm naked, and then jumping out of the bush and running down the street. That happened in less than 5 minutes. That was one thought, just boom, 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 boom. It happened too fast for me to think or process what I was doing. It was just instinct. It was, I will do whatever it takes to survive in this instant. I don't care how desperate it is. I don't care how humiliating it is. I don't care if it's a risk. It's a risk I'll take because it's the only choice I have. That was my thought process. It didn't make sense. But does it ever when you're in that situation? I don't think so. I really don't think it's fair for people to judge survivors of situations like that. Mine was perceived, but the feeling of threat that I had was real. And for people to judge people who survive anything that grand, it's like, unless you've ever been in the shoes where you would literally do anything it took to stay alive, you don't get to judge, because you don't know what it does to your mind. How your mind completely shifts and goes into survival mode and shuts off all other, unnecessary thought, like how it just zeroes in laser beams onto the one focus being to get out alive. If you've never, ever been in a situation where your life depended on that kind of survival, you do not get to judge. And I don't know if this heightened survival mode is common for people with psychosis, but I know it happens for me frequently. And I know there are several examples I can think of having been put into that kind of survival mode where the decisions I made may not have been the best ones, but they were the only options I had at the time. Because my thought process, if I were to sum it up, is, okay, there's a threat. I have 2 seconds to make a decision. The decision is going to be the first thing I think of, and it's not always going to be the best choice. First thought wrong, as they say, and it oftentimes is. But under that stress, what are you going to do? Right? Are you going to do it? You have no choice. You have to. So as you can see, the thought processes I've had in psychosis have been, during baseline times, I would say, having logical responses to illogical situations, things that I feel other people would probably agree would be the right thing to do. If it actually happened, it's just only happening to me. And they've also been survival mode, where I'm acting on instinct. I'm not thinking things through necessarily. I'm in a state of desperation where I need to make it out alive. And there have also been thought processes I've had that have led me to do things that are completely against my values, things that I would never normally do. One example of something that I did that I would never, ever normally do is that I burned a book. And I'm strongly opposed to book burning because I grew up in a very Jewish community, and I went to Jewish camp for 9 years. I slow danced with my crush at his bar mitzvah. I may not personally be Jewish, but Judaism is important to me and I respect it a great deal. And I have a lot of compassion for the events of the Holocaust. So I learned growing up that in an act of censorship, Nazis would burn Jewish literature to eradicate just centuries of knowledge and culture and history. And I was always really opposed to that. That was pretty awful what they did there. So for me to burn a book, that took something a lot bigger than me. That was something outside of my control, in the sense that I felt pushed to do this because my mind thought that the book was possessed, and the only way I could save myself from being possessed by the book was to burn it. This is so out of character for me, but in that psychotic state, I didn't really feel that there was another option. I thought this was the only way to take care of this situation. And I wouldn't say it was the same kind of imminent threat that I had when I believed I would be abducted by the FBI or abducted by aliens, because that was going to be immediately happening to me. This was something that I could do something about, and I could resolve it on my own, and I could think through my actions. And in thinking through, what are my options here? Could I do this? Could I give it away to a friend? Could I throw it in a dumpster? Really, the only solution was to burn it. So even with thinking through my actions, that was the best decision I could come up with. Now, when I talked about this online, I did face some criticism from some environmentally inclined people who were upset that I had done something bad for the environment, and they had said, you should have buried the book. You shouldn't have burned the book. That's bad for the environment. You should have thought this. And again, there's no telling a person with psychosis, you should have thought anything, because my thought process is not the same as yours, bucko. So while that would have been preferable, and I may have considered that to be an option, in my mind, it was not the correct option, because it would still be in book form. It wouldn't be completely burst into ashes. And the only way to handle a demonically possessed book, naturally, is to completely obliterate it. So in my mind, yeah, it'd be nice to think I might do something kind for the environment. If I had been in my right mind, I might have buried the book. But also, if I had been in my right mind, I wouldn't have thought it was possessed and gotten rid of it at all. Which brings me to my final point, and that is you've really got to play the tape through. Before telling a person with psychosis that you should have thought this, consider that you don't have the full story. Because oftentimes, if you will just take a minute and hear them out, what might start as a really irrational thought will unravel an entire thread of thoughts that actually does check out. You just got to see it through to the end. Because I swear to God, there have been so many times when people have heard just the beginning of what I went through and immediately thought, okay, but that doesn't make sense. And then when I've told the entire story, they've been like, I do see how you came to that conclusion. That is not logical, but I can see why you would think that made sense. And that's why psychosis has its own logic, because to me, it really does check out. You've just got to play the tape through. One time when I was in the hospital, I believed that I was in control of day and night, and to change night to day and day to night, I would flicker a light switch. So I was just rapid firing through the calendar, going day, night, day, night, day, night, just on and on and on. And then one of the staff had to come tell me to stop doing that because it was keeping the other patients awake. And I was basically like, no, but I have to, because the man on the basketball court was holding the basketball. So I can't stop doing this. It's my duty. And that probably didn't really make sense to him. But in my mind, there was a man on a basketball court that day who I saw holding a basketball. And to me, that represented the sun. So this man was in control of the sun, and that meant I was in control of the moon, and our two powers together allowed me to change day into night. So long as he was on the ward with me, I had that control, and that didn't really come out verbally, and it didn't make sense to him. But if you follow the line of thought that I had, it actually kind of, in a way, makes sense. It doesn't make sense that a basketball is literally the sun, but it does kind of make sense that I would draw these associations. I can't remember the name of this symptom off the top of my head, but it is a thought disorder. It is a symptom of disorganized speech and thought in which people draw loose associations and kind of go on these tangents where their associations sort of craft a line of thought. And so in that line of thought, I had a lot of different reasonings for things like why I was in control of flickering light switches in the dead of night in the psych ward. Beyond that, I've had conversations with people outside of psychosis where I've explained the rationality from a sound point of view. So I no longer would believe these things, but I can parse out outside of psychosis what I was thinking and why I was thinking it. And this is actually a really great way that I've been able to explain, for instance, in this video, why my mind works the way it does. And one recent conversation I had was with a person who couldn't understand why I didn't go to the hospital. I had a delusion that my leg was harmed, and I, didn't go to the hospital. This person was questioning this, like, why wouldn't you think to go to the hospital? And it's like, well, I wouldn't think to go to the hospital because I'd more likely go see a witch doctor. And they'd be like, okay, well, what if the hospital was the better place to go? Like, why didn't you think a doctor would be the right person to go to and not a witch doctor? And I'm like, well, because I didn't trust doctors. Well, why wouldn't you trust doctors? Because, blah, 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 they signed an oath, yada, yada, yada. Well, I wouldn't trust doctors because they'd turn me into a dog. Well, what's wrong with being a dog? Wouldn't it be great to be a dog? I want to be a dog. Okay, if you've never had that delusion, I don't think you want it, first of all. And, my thinking is that if I'm being turned into a dog by a doctor, it's because they're trying to silence me for speaking the truth, and I will not be silenced. And only then was this person like, oh, I get it. That's why you didn't go to the hospital. And it's like, yeah. So when you first hear, oh, my leg is harmed and I'm not going to the hospital, you might have this assumption that a lot of people do of you should have thought better. You should have thought to do this. And I would think this. Why wouldn't you think to do that? And then when you unravel it, you find out that going to the hospital is probably the scariest thing you could think to do. But they're not thinking like that. So their mind probably wouldn't go there. Like, I don't think people who haven't had psychosis would even stop to think that a valid fear of going to the hospital might be that you'd be turned into a dog and silenced for speaking the truth, because, that's not something that really happens. So why would you think that would be someone's line of thinking? Well, as someone who's had that line of thinking, I can say that it does have its own rationality. I think it's perfectly rational that I wouldn't want to go to the hospital if I thought those would be my consequences. So I think it's fair. I don't think everybody understands it. I don't think you have to, but I think there should be grace lended towards people with psychosis for why their thoughts might be different than other people's, why it's perfectly valid for them to think in their own way. I think that about sums up this video, basically to say that there is somewhat of a rationality behind thoughts in psychosis that maybe not everyone relates to, but you might better understand after having heard my points. So that's about it for today. I love that you've all stuck around for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts have been like, or what kind of thoughts you've seen come out of others around you who may experience psychosis. I'd love to hear from you. I make videos every Thursday/Friday, as well as TikTok compilations on Mondays. And if you'd like to support my channel, you could like, comment, subscribe, or hit that bell to get notifications to my future videos. And I'll see you all in the next one. Bye! So close your eyes.